All right. That may be too much light. Let's see here. That's okay. All right. Hello. This is, um, well, personality disorders. So we're on chapter 11. Um, so that will be our discussion tonight. There is my cats making themselves known. We'll be talking about personality disorders, and this is a section that probably interests some of you, even though you may not know it. This is a group that we traditionally group of disorders that we often associate with some rather interesting characters. Some of your, um, you know, serial killers and mass murderers and things like that. They often fall into this category. Politicians, successful business people, and then also just sort of criminals and um, not so nice people. So we'll talk about some of those things as we go throughout the night. Oh my gosh, I'm being attacked here. Just give them a minute to wander in front of the screen. These wild animals. Um, Here, boys, you want to say hello? You all seen the other one. This is my big baby. Hi, say hi. You obviously want to be seen. Um, so we'll talk about the different types of personality disorders. This section is a little different. There's relatively little in terms of treatment for personality disorder, so we'll mostly talk about the different categories. I will post some videos this week because I think this is a section that warrants a lot of use of examples and videos because I think there's some cool stuff out there. So I'll show you some different examples of different personality disorders. Also share with you some interviews of some of our mass murderers and serial killers that might fall under the antisocial category. This is also a section where we can talk about politics, but we won't. We've had enough of that. The election, we will probably have an election by the time you watch this, and all of us are positively over that. So I will limit my discussion of politicians, even though I will say the majority of them, regardless of which side you prefer, there are representatives who will fall under some of these categories. So I'll talk to you about them and you can decide for yourself. Essentially, there's three clusters of personality disorders. Odd personality disorders, which are paranoid, schizoid, schizotypal, eccentric, which is the cluster B, antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic. Those are the ones that we'll focus most of the time on and the ones that you probably are more interested in. And then cluster B, which is just sort of this avoidant group, this avoidant personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, and obsessive compulsive. I will tell you, we don't know nearly as much about cluster A and cluster C because they don't typically come into treatment. Where we know these folks is from like the criminal justice system or from other sources that don't involve coming into therapy because there isn't a lot of therapy we can do. And those people are pretty much by and large mistrustful, and so I hope that makes sense. What is a personality disorder? So essentially a personality disorder is different than all of the things that we're going to talk about. It isn't a brain disorder. Depression, anxiety disorder, and substance use, and all of these things have more to do with brain chemistry, neurotransmitters. We'll talk about schizophrenia, I think, next week. Brain disorder. All of those things are primarily implicated in malfunctions in your brain or neurotransmitters. The difference here is that personality disorders certainly are not that. They are maladaptive ways of dealing with problems, maladaptive thoughts, and they are learned over time. There is some, I guess you could say, familial component. Often these disorders run in families, even a genetic component, like a smaller than some of the other disorders. But they're generally, that generally is more of a predisposition. This is just a dysfunctional adaptation or way of dealing with stress. It lasts often throughout a lifetime. Although I will say, particularly with some of those cluster B, the antisocial, borderline narcissistic, there's this toning down that occurs as you get into midlife, and you start to see less and less symptoms. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go on. So they're maladaptive. They cause a lot of distress and a lot of impairment, which makes them a disorder, right? When we talk about what makes a disorder, it goes on for a definitive length of time, and we'll talk about what that is. It causes disruption and impairment in your daily life and functioning, and this is certainly meets those criteria. Very high cognitive disorders and substance use and depression and just about every disorder that you can think of has high comorbidity rates with some of these disorders. Prognosis is terrible. Your book says poorer. It's terrible. We don't really know how to treat it. Exactly one of the disorders has a treatment. Borderline personality disorder is the only one that has the empirically validated evidence-based treatment, which is what we look for when we're talking about treatments. The rest do not. So the prognosis is pretty poor and treatment is poor, and it's very hard to get people into treatment. Turn off my phone here. Okay. So, there was, I'm going to make this short because I could go on forever about this, but there was a big ordeal with the making of the DSM-5 about potentially eliminating some of, eliminating personality disorders from the DSM. Reed really ended up doing was just changing some of the definitions to, there's a lot of overlap in symptomology. And so we just sort of tightened up some of the definitions without really eliminating personality disorders. In DSM-4 and previous, there was a 5-axial system, which means axis 1 was major mental disorder, the general cause of impairment. And axis 2 was personality disorder or intellectual disability. And so that axial system was eliminated with the advent of the DSM, the DSM-5. And so we have now personality disorders in terms of diagnostic importance are on the same field as things like depression and schizophrenia and that sort of thing. So that was very helpful. But I don't want to go into that too much. So how common are they? About, shall we say, 1% of the population. So about the same prevalence as something like schizophrenia, which is relatively uncommon. This is probably an underdiagnosed group because they look kind of strange sometimes when we diagnose them with other things. And I'll tell you, quite honestly, a lot of diagnosis is driven by the insurance industry. And insurances typically will not pay for a primary personality disorder diagnosis. If I go as a therapist and bill insurance and say, this person, the reason I'm treating them is antisocial personality disorder, chances are insurance is not going to pay for that. If I say they have depression and antisocial personality disorder, they're likely to pay me. So a lot of times their diagnoses are driven by insurance. That's no surprise to anyone, right? I went to the doctor one time for a thing, and he told me insurance won't pay for that. So tell me one of these things that might apply to you. That's just sort of how insurance works. And so taking out the different category will help eventually, but insurance companies are slow to adapt and still currently don't really pay for personality disorder. As a result, therapists are less likely to diagnose them. There's also a ton of stigma, even in our world, on personality disorders. Like if you're reading a chart and you see that someone has a personality disorder, a lot of therapists are like, I don't really want to deal with that. That's going to be a headache. And truth be told, it can be. But it doesn't have to be. Like it's a population that I've worked with a lot over my career and relatively enjoy. So it's I don't know, but that does play a role. There are therapists who will be reluctant to diagnose this because there's a fear that it will leave a stigma that attaches to the patient, and I think that's a real issue. So anyhow, it does tend to begin in childhood, this maladaptive way of dealing with problems, and it tends to run this chronic course throughout a lifetime, and it may dampen as you age, and also you may adapt into different personality disorders. In some situations, different disorders altogether. There is some gender bias here. One of the things that we noticed was some of the disorders are very similar, particularly in clusters. Diagnosis like antisocial personality disorder tends to be diagnosed more in men. Histrionic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder tend to be diagnosed more in women. There isn't a lot of difference in some of the symptoms, and so we just tend to associate some of the disorders more with one gender versus the other. This makes it very complicated. Excuse me while I get out of here. What was I saying? These cats are being very disruptive. I may get up and lock them out. Actually, yes, let me do that. Time out.
Come here, boys.
That is really easy to do because they're not very smart. So, where was I? Gender bias. Yes, we tend to have certain disorders that are more common in men and different disorders that are more common in women. And as we go through, I'll point some of those out. Your book has a graph that I think is interesting. It doesn't play as well if I can't show you the graph, but it is, let's see. I can't see the page that it's on, but it's a infographic on antisocial personality disorder and histrionic personality disorder by gender. And it shows you that antisocial personality disorder is diagnosed, percentage of cases of males far outweigh percentage of cases of females. And histrionic cases are inverted, so they're far more common in females than males. And so you can see that in the graphic there, which I think is interesting to see actual numbers. So I'll talk a little bit about some of these, but not go into great depth on all of them because we just don't know a lot. Paranoid personality disorder is one that you don't see a lot in clinical presentations, and often you mistake it for something else. It's this pervasive pattern of unjustified mistrust or suspicion. It can be like a biological thing. There are psychological contributions, but the breakdown is sort of unclear. What we generally find is people learn early on that they cannot trust the world. It's very Freudian. It's just, I guess, Erikson, trust versus mistrust. You generally learn that the world is not a place you can depend on. People in your life aren't reliable. And so this paranoid personality disorder sort of evolves out of that. Truth be told, most of the personality disorders come from that in some way or another. Your basic needs are not being met. But this one, there's a lot of trust and suspicion, or mistrust and suspicion. The treatment options are relatively poor. Not a lot of people seek treatment because they don't trust you. And there is, let me first just say, I'm going off the PowerPoints from the textbook, and they're all over the place. So they go through each disorder twice. So I'm going to probably jump around a little bit here from what your slides look like, but I will try to not duplicate information. But anyway, treatment options are pretty rare. You may use some cognitive behavior to look at approaching some of the negative thinking, but that is not terribly effective, truth be told, and a lot of lack of good outcome studies. A good example of this in a movie is, and I'll post a little clip of this later, is the Mel Gibson character in Conspiracy Theory. Conspiracy theorists in general often fall under this category, and not just people who don't trust the internet or whatever they believe. You know those people who always think somebody's out to get them or distrust them. So Mel Gibson's character in Conspiracy Theory is a good example. Also, you can see this, that people tend to be very distrustful in relationships. They tend to always think the other person is up to something, or friendships, or what have you. There's always this just general distrust out there in the world. Another cluster A personality disorder is schizoid personality disorder. Again, one that we don't see a lot of. They have a very limited range of emotion and seem detached, particularly in social relationships. They're not pursuing a lot of social relationships. So have relatively few friends, relatively few interpersonal relationships. Maybe outside of family or like a few close friends, but they're very limited socially. Often you see this in childhood with kids just being really, really shy and isolating. Sometimes it can look like autism, but it's different in that the social isolation is really the only common element there. They don't have the other characteristics of autism, but sometimes get mistaken for that because people don't really know what to do with it. Again, treatment options are pretty rare. You may try to build social skills, some social skills training, which is also an overlap with autism treatment that is used in autism, is trying to improve interaction within groups. So if that's your major deficit, then obviously that can be beneficial. But few of these people are actually going to seek treatment. Another one is schizotypal personality disorder. This one they're particularly unusual in appearance. They also are socially isolated. They also have some paranoia. Everybody in this group is going to be a little bit paranoid because that's the overlying theme of cluster A, is the paranoia. So the socially isolated, some paranoia. They may have some magical thinking or fantastical thinking. We'll talk about that in the section. Many meet the criteria for depression, and some see this as sort of a milder form of schizophrenia. And in fact, many people who are diagnosed with this as juveniles or young adults go on to develop schizophrenia. So it may be a precursor to another disorder, which makes it a little different than other personality disorders, which is there's no clear line between, say, depression and histrionic personality disorder. They're pick any disorders at random. They're not predictive, but this one does tend to be a precursor to schizophrenia with some people. So just a good example here, client that I worked with some number of years ago, probably more than 10 years ago now. He was a young man, like just turned 18. He dressed kind of all in black, but not even all in black. He had like these weird like silk capes that he would wear. He had his teeth filed to like points, and he like hung out with people who essentially thought they were vampires. And it wasn't a delusional type of thing, but they were just shared this more than interest, just sort of obsession with sort of the occult and with vampirism and things like that. And so he was odd in appearance. He tended to isolate. He had a job that required him no human interaction at all. He was very just like peculiar and suspicious. And really the only interaction was with this very small group that shared the same interest. And a lot of that was online. So he looked the part. Um, so as I said earlier, there's a fair number of these folks, a quarter to a half, who meet criteria for major depressive disorder. So sometimes we have to look at that when we're talking about treatment. The main focus here is improving social skills, as with schizoid personality disorder. Also, the medicinal treatments can be similar to that with schizophrenia because of some of the fantastical and sometimes delusional thought content. And the treatment prognosis is pretty poor. Again, people are less likely to get into treatment because of the general distrust. And then let's see, what is that? I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit and then come back. No, let's just go through it like that. I should have worked this out before I brought you all into it. There's some like prevalent stats and stuff like that later we'll talk about, but we'll just go through it like this. Antisocial, where did it go? Antisocial personality disorder is the first of the cluster B personality disorders. And generally what this is, a failure to comply with societal norms, rules, laws. They may disobey parents. Often this pops up in adolescent in the form of like conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder. So this general disregard for rules. Oftentimes kids with this have ended up in the juvenile detention centers, and adults have ended up incarcerated or in some legal trouble because they just have disregard for the laws. They feel like they don't apply to them in the same way. And they also often are keen to violate the rights of others. So they will steal, physically assault other people, sexual assault. They just have no regard for others. They tend to be irresponsible and impulsive, often deceitful, again, because they don't really care about you or what society thinks. So it's just sort of a means to an end oftentimes. There's a lack of conscience and empathy, a lack of remorse that comes along with this. And sociopathy and psychopathy, sociopaths and psychopaths typically fall under this category. So that's a terminology that often you all are aware of already. And if you ever are curious or want to know more, there's a great book called Without Conscience by Robert Hare. Very good look at antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy and sociopathy. So very much worth time to look into. It's a fairly short book, and it's just fascinating to read. He created the psychopath checklist, and so like he talk about experts in your field, he is the expert. So Without Conscience, I'll put a link up. They may be very charming and often manipulative. So it's easy for them to get people to like them because they'll say whatever they need to say. They'll do whatever they need to do to manipulate you into liking them. And they can be very charming. This is where I talk about successful business people and politicians. They don't care who they hurt getting where they want to get. They don't care what they do or the cost to other people. They're all about being successful. So a lot of really successful Fortune 500 CEOs, a lot of really successful politicians get there by being these kind of people and having these sort of traits. Even if they don't meet criteria, they have some of the traits of some of these disorders. And so sometimes this can serve people well. Other times it leads them into sort of, criminal involvement and, so it's all about where you fall in the spectrum. You'll have some who are very successful at doing this and others who can't stay out of their own way and end up in, the correctional system or prison system as a result. So, as I mentioned, there is a lot of early life behavior problems and conduct problems that come along with antisocial personality. In fact, having an antisocial diagnosis as an adult requires some presence of this type of behavior as a child or as a juvenile. So it's sort of necessary for this to have been there. Often it's undiagnosed, but you go back and ask family or teachers, and they'll say, yeah, we saw that type of behavior there. You know, the traditional fire setting, hurting animals, that sort of thing. Some of those traditional behaviors, but also things like skipping school and getting in a lot of fights and stealing, you know, what have you. So often this disorder pops up in families that have inconsistent parenting and lack of criminal and violent behavior. Tend to have kids who fall in this category. So there's some indication that there's some school of thoughts that say antisocial personality disorder is caused by sort of under arousal. So your cortical arousal, cortisol, if you'll remember, is that the stress hormone, and increase in cortisol causes like more anxiety. And so these people have sort of low levels of cortisol, low levels of stimulation, and need more arousal in their life than most people get just to be at baseline. So some of this can be like thrill-seeking behavior. And I do think there is something to that. This type of seeking out attention, seeking out stimulus, and you certainly see that from time to time in some of these also the fearlessness hypothesis. This falls in line with the notion that they don't fear consequences. They don't fear reprisal or getting caught or getting in trouble. You know, things like, for most kids, the threat of detention or, you know, getting expelled from school may carry a lot of weight and deter. But for these kids, it's not likely to. Maybe because they've been in a lot of trouble before, they know how the system works, but also their brains just operate differently. And the same thing is true with adults. A lot of adults are deterred from doing bad things by the fear of going to jail or prison. Not so much with this group. So it is something that you definitely see is a major difference in populations, the antisocial populations. And there's some other theories too, but I think those two are the ones that sort of make the most sense, just intuitively, really. Treatment is, well, traditionally, the thing that is probably you're not really supposed to say these days, but traditionally it was said that the best course of treatment for someone with antisocial personality disorder is jail or prison. And there's still some of that school of thought around, although we do know that's a little oversimplified, and our system doesn't really work like that. So the prognosis is poor, treatment options are poor, and you have to focus on sort of different consequences. So the consequences can't be, you can't normally, if I'm approaching someone talking about the consequences of bad behavior, if you do this, you may go to jail. But if that's not an important consequence to them, that doesn't, doesn't hold the same weight. It's not the same threat. So you have to rob someone, you're going to go to jail, and you're not going to have the opportunity to do something particularly like. You may throw in the fact that they're going to go to jail, but it's not the jail that's going to deter them. It's more of a selfish approach to dealing with the problem behavior. So the approach has to be a little different. There is some genetic influence here. You're more likely to develop the disorder if you have parents who have a history of criminal behavior or antisocial behavior. Worked in a jail for quite a long time and saw entire families of people coming into the jail, children and grandparents and parents, siblings. So definitely there is this sort of, it is this genetic predisposition, but also it's in the environment. High conflict childhood increases the likelihood of antisocial personality disorder in at-risk kids. So high conflict meaning they're in situations where they see like assault and domestic violence and things like that. Unstable living situations in general. It's not really well explained in like there's no neurological causes that are easily identified for it. So again, it makes it a little different than the other disorders that we talk about. Let's see. One of the things I mentioned the arousal theory earlier, that people with antisocial personality disorder are chronically under aroused and seek stimulation. Another theory, not theory necessarily, but research indicates that psychopaths are less likely to give up when the goal is unattainable. They're persistent with behavior even when it's punished. And part of that is this lack of connection with consequence. And so they don't see failure as being the deterrent that some of us do, because there's this belief that they're capable of doing it, whether or not they actually are. So it's very difficult to kind of deal with. Let's see. Kind of skip ahead. Another cluster B. So in terms of antisocial personality disorder, we'll come back to this a little bit later, but some of your classic examples are some of your serial killers, folks like Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, very different types of people. So you see like the wider range. And then you get into sort of political figures like, I'll go outside of American politics and talk historical politics. People like Mussolini and certainly like, Hitler and some of those types, with that blatant disregard for society or rule or the, kind of feelings of certain people. But typically we think about like the Jack the Rippers and, some of the more sensational characters. And it's easy to see there and see the thought patterns and the types of people that they are. And so it makes it easy to do. So the other second cluster B is borderline personality disorder, also probably the most common in clinical settings, because it's the only one where there's an actual treatment. It's characterized by unstable moods and relationships, impulsivity, fear of abandonment, very poor self-image. Often this disorder is associated with self-mutilation. Often we see that as cutting, and this can look different. Cutting can look different among different populations. It can be done for different reasons, but the self-mutilation, and it can be other things other than cutting. Self-mutilation can be burning or picking or any number of things, but more often it's seen as burning or is seen as cutting. And it is not always, there's this sort of stigma that it's always a cry for attention, but it isn't always, because you can see a function of where the self-mutilation is located. Many self-mutilators do it in places that aren't really easily evident, like on the tops of their arms or on their inner thighs, places that aren't visible unless they're without clothes. So if you wanted it to be somewhere that other people would notice it, if it were more of a call for attention, it's going to be somewhere more visible generally. And certainly you do see that. You see people who cut in places that are more apparent, but that isn't always the case. And also, these are not always suicidal in nature. About 19 or 20% of individuals with borderline personality disorder who self-mutilate are going to go on to commit suicide. Most of the self-injury, self-mutilation is not suicidal in nature. There's a good episode of House, and I can't remember which one it is, but where Dr. House is trying to give up opiates. He's trying to quit Vicodin. And he, one of the doctors comes over to check on him, and he's like cut his arm. The reason he did that is the same reason that a lot of individuals with borderline personality disorder give, that they self-injure, self-mutilate. It's because of the release of endorphins. That release of endorphins is similar to the effect of a pain pill, in Dr. House's case, Vicodin. So it creates that sensation of the surge of endorphins as your body's attempt to fight the pain. In our borderline personality disorder, the function can be that release of endorphins, these feel-good chemicals, or it can be control. It sometimes could be attention. So there's many different paths or reasons that people do that, but it isn't as easy as just saying it's for attention. Comorbidity rates with borderline personality disorder are really high with other disorders, particularly mood disorders, depression, bipolar disorder, also anxiety, substance use. They tend to be very highly emotionally reactive, and that's something that has existed before their diagnosis existed. It probably existed as children. It tends to run in families. There may be some limbic system functioning that's impaired there. And often people who have this disorder also have histories of trauma. So it sort of has this triple vulnerability model. They're biologically vulnerable and more reactive than other people. They are psychologically vulnerable and to lash people when they feel threatened. And the specific vulnerability, the stressors that elicit borderline personality disorder. The treatment medications, I mentioned this is one of the disorders that we have treatment for. And I'm going to be talking about dialectical behavior therapy because I think it's really interesting. And if you're interested in borderline personality disorder or personality disorders in general, it's a really good treatment to kind of wrap your head around. And it's, truth be told, we use it in a lot of different areas too. We use it in some of the parts of it in dealing with depression or anxiety or other trauma. So antidepressants work well here for some of the short-term treatments and to get people through some really bad times. But DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, is the most promising and most empirically valid treatment for dealing with this disorder. And it focuses on acceptance of difficulties, need to change. So the idea behind acceptance is essentially what it is. It is okay to be upset. It's okay to feel lonely or feel anxious or to feel whatever you're feeling. And you have to be open to the idea that you can't always make that go away and you can't always change that. You have to be accepting of some part of this. Also, there's a focus on sort of interpersonal communication and dealing with other people, and a focus on distress tolerance to eliminate, decrease some of this reckless behavior, some of the self-mutilation, some of that sort of thing. How do we cope with the idea that everything is just sometimes going to be bad? There are going to be times in our life when we're not happy and times in our life when we're stressed out. How do we cope with that? So using some distress tolerance techniques is also part of that. And one of the videos that I'll post has some more on this that you could look at. Another cluster B personality disorder is histrionic personality disorder. And when we talk about this section being dramatic and erratic, this would be the more dramatic part. Very dramatic and sensational, often in a sexual way, generally sexually provocative, very impulsive, and they need to be the center of attention. Unlike some of the other, like cluster A, which never want anybody to know they're existing, this group is very keen on making sure everyone in the room is aware of them. They may dress very provocatively. They're going to do anything and everything they can to be able to get some level of attention. They're perceived as being really shallow and not a lot of depth of emotion, and it's most commonly diagnosed in females. I mentioned that earlier. Society there's a sociological view that this is a product of sort of the me generation, but I'll tell you that doesn't necessarily hold up, because this is a disorder that has been around for a long time. I like to think of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind as a very early example of this. Very dramatic, very sensational, always needing to be kind of the center of attention. And then we have narcissistic personality disorder, which kind of rounds out the cluster B. These are very similar to antisocial personality disorder. In fact, they overlap quite a lot. This exaggerated and unreasonable sense of self-importance, which can kind of go along with some of the things we talked about with antisocial personality disorder. They're preoccupied with needing attention, but not in the same way the histrionic group need attention. They believe they should be receiving attention because they're superior to everyone else. And they often lack sensitivity and compassion for other people. So again, they can be very harmful and threatening and hurtful to other people. They can also be really successful because they have this inflated sense of their own ability. And if you believe it, often other people believe it too. Again, oftentimes our politicians and successful business people fall under this. In fact, many of you watching this at home will have some of the traits similar to this. Research tends to suggest that people who are more educated and smarter tend to think more of their own abilities and share more traits similar with a person with narcissistic personality disorder. Again, not having narcissistic personality disorder, they don't meet all of the criteria, but they certainly have some of the components of this. You think you're superior in some ways in reality because you are. And not to say you're superior in every way, but you have some advantages over some other people. And generally college students in particular tend to rate themselves higher than general public. These groups also tend to be very sensitive to criticism, often very arrogant. And again, treatment is not terribly effective. There's a lot of lines drawn to lack of ability to learn empathy as a kid. So again, very similar to some of the other things that we've talked about. This is my notes and it's going out on me. So I'm going to switch over here to another device, but I'll keep talking. Avoidant personality disorder is the first of cluster C. And this is, these folks tend to be, avoidant. It's in the name. They're very sensitive of the opinions of other people. But again, not really in the same way as some of the other disorders are. They're very avoidant of interpersonal relationships. In fact, they're likely to be loners. They may have some relationships with family members, but generally not a lot of friends, not a lot of romantic relationships. They often have very low self-esteem and a whole lot of anxiety and fear of rejection. This is probably linked to a difficult temperament as a child and a lot of early rejection in your life. And so this is, again, something that tends to pop up pretty early on. Treatment generally is treated like a treatment for anxiety or social phobias. Building social skills is also a component of it. But again, not a lot of these folks enter into treatment. The second of the cluster C is dependent personality disorder. And these people rely entirely on other people to make decisions for them. They tend to pair up with people like antisocial or narcissistic personality disorders because they want to make all of the decisions and be very controlling. Dependent personality disorders love to be controlled and have other people make their decisions. They will entirely want other people to make their decisions for them. and they have this unreasonable fear of abandonment. They tend to be very clingy and needy in interpersonal relationships, and also very, very submissive. Again, they don't want to make decisions. They don't feel comfortable. They would rather be in a relationship where they are controlled by someone else. And this is probably due to some disruptions in learning independence early on and having to rely entirely on other people to have their needs met, and just not feeling confident in their own abilities. Treatment is lacking. Not a lot of evidence of any kind of successful treatment at all. They do tend to be very clingy of therapists. They will come to therapy. They will come to therapy for a long time. They won't learn anything, but they will never leave. They become dependent on the therapist. So this is a tough group to work with. They will agree with whatever you say, but they won't do any of the things that you tell them to do. So it becomes very, very challenging. The next is obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And this is not like obsessive compulsive disorder. I wish it were named something else. This is sort of, it's an excessive and rigid fixation on doing something the right way, tend to be very orderly and perfectionistic. And that is not necessarily like obsessive compulsive disorder. There's not the obsessions and compulsions. You're not checking light switches. You're not retracing your steps or getting up to check windows, things like that. Not washing your hands millions of times. This is just this need for orderliness and to be perfectionist, and also pretty emotionally shallow. So it tends to be, tend to be confused. Again, not a lot of treatment options, as is the case with most of these things. Okay. So pretty much that's that. And I'm going to post several different videos, some of which I think you'll find very interesting. I'm going to post some conversations with some people who fall under this antisocial category. I'm also going to post like a little bit longer video that looks at different movie clips that represent each of the personality disorders. And I think that's very worthwhile to help you remember, because it's all things that we can generally associate with. But I do think it's worthwhile to watch these, particularly in this case. So just as a wrap up, if you have any questions or anything you need to know, please just reach out to me. Send me an email, and we can discuss. I think most of you have got exams from most of you, other assignments from most of you. I think I have everything up until the stuff that is due this week. Get confused because I make these early. I'm trying to think which week I'm on in terms of grading, but I think I'm mostly caught up. If there's anything you have questions about, just shoot me an email. But have a good week, and the next time I talk to you, we will be through this awful election stuff and can talk about something else. So, all right, have a good week, and thank you.